Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today I'm with Ken. Ken, can you please introduce yourself and share a bit about what you do?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ken Englund. I'm a partner at Ernst & Young. I run our tech media telco business for the Americas, and I spend a tremendous amount of time working with high-tech, hyper-growth companies to large-scale tech companies as well.
Excellent. And you recently conducted a technology pulse poll that found that senior tech leaders, a lot of them believe that remote work positively impacts their ability to innovate. Tell me a little bit about that and the seeming contradiction between tech companies believing that they are able to innovate better with remote work, while also right now increasingly asking their staff to come back to the office.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces in that equation. And in our survey, there were two pieces. One was whether there was a positive result, almost 80% of working virtually and remotely, and then a correlation of a high 70% around whether they believe it was driving significant innovation. And I think the two pieces kind of go hand in hand. The first piece was really around the level of talent that are available to these companies on a broader basis than just in Silicon Valley or just in New York or in Austin. I think the second piece that I find particularly useful and interesting with tech companies is they've been on the road to a lot of async virtual collaboration for a long time. So maybe where other companies have struggled with some of that virtual work, I find tech is pretty well ingrained in that activity.
Okay, excellent. Now, given that, what do you make of a lot of tech companies, even Zoom, Salesforce, Amazon, of course, Google, asking their employees to come back to the office?
Yeah, I think there's some risk involved with this. Really an interesting time. We just completed a recent new survey around workplace, and I would say employees still have a little bit of leverage and upper hand on employers. The trend continues to ebb a little bit, but I think a lot of it has to do with a little bit of command and control behavior, I think, from that perspective. I also think what's interesting is there's not a clear definition of what return to work means. In a recent survey that we conducted, employers believed return to work was going to be 3 days a week, at least in office was their goal. Employees actually responded differently in saying they were committed to 1 day a week. So there's you've got to square a circle here one way or the other. So there's going to continue to be a lot of tension in this space.
So going back to the first answer about innovation and the second point about command and control, is it your perception that leaders are sacrificing innovation for the sake of command and control?
No, I think ideally, tremendous amount of innovation occurs in person wherever possible. I mean, I've been involved with startups, late stage private hyper growth companies. And I think the optimal answer continues to be in person. But I think the decrease in sort of efficiency is fairly nominal in the innovation space, right? I think it's the way I describe it is maybe the fear is more overblown about a lack of innovation or productivity. My experience has certainly said that all employees can be highly productive in a virtual environment.
So it sounds like tech leaders are saying that employees can be highly productive, and they see remote work as facilitating innovation, especially through expanding the hiring. Of course, they can't expand the hiring pool beyond their office locations. In fact, Amazon is asking their employees to move to 9 office hubs from smaller office spaces. And of course, more people are leaving Amazon because of that. So what we're seeing is that Amazon and other companies seem to be sacrificing the innovation, the talent they can get from hiring workers remotely for the sake of that command and control perception, which you perceive as, and you're saying is overblown in leaders' minds. So you're saying that leaders are kind of making a mistake through this return to office mandate.
Well, I'm saying not that there's a mistake, but I think there is risk in it. So in our recent survey around workplace, a third of employees are going to be potentially looking for new careers or jobs in the next 12 months. So if you factor in that level of a workforce, and we surveyed over 17,000 people globally, there's risk in changing this discussion. I think, Gleb, you sort of refer to sort of status quo bias. I also think there's some risk aversion, loss aversion in taking away some flexibility in the marketplace. What we've also found is really interesting in our last survey is that actually employers believe 80% of them that there's a strategic value to flexibility. Employees themselves view about 60% of them viewing the added value and flexibility. So our point being is that employees do value flexibility, but there's other parts of their overall compensation and benefits that are maybe equally important.
So when we look at compensation, there's a number of surveys. I'm curious what you found is that flexibility ranks, generally speaking, as the second most priority after the salary. What are you finding in terms of what employees value in that ranking?
Yeah, I think reasonably speaking, flexibility is 2 or 3 on the list historically. With what people are going to getting paid is obviously always the primary driver, is what we see.
And so it seems like companies that offer more flexibility are going to be able to both decrease their costs of hiring, and if they offer full flexibility in the sense of offering full-time remote work, they're going to be expanding their talent pool for hiring. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I believe that's absolutely the case. And I would stress the latter around increasing your talent pool for hiring being a really compelling reason to consider this. And then we've talked about in office and sort of virtual, but I think the real trick will be around the hybrid workplace, around how we communicate, how we set expectations, how we run meetings. I think the technology part of this, the collaboration tools are pretty robust. I haven't seen a lot of concerns and issues in the market or with my clients, but literally sort of the foundational structures, right? How we talk to people, how we set expectations become much more critical in a hybrid work environment.
Yeah, they do. I'm going to be the keynote presenter for the Canadian government heads of civil service tomorrow, I believe, specifically about this topic. How do you work in a hybrid work environment? So let's double click on that. What are your perceptions of some of the best practices for working in a hybrid work environment?
Yeah, first I would say maybe before talk about the hybrid work environment, I would talk about what return to work means. So,
Sure.
we've seen, I mentioned a little bit about a survey information about sort of a missed expectation between employees and employers, but return to office could mean full-time, which seems to be really on the small end of the spectrum in terms of companies requiring that. But is it 3 days a week set? Is it 3 days a week, but 2 are fixed? Is it 1 week a month? So I think what's critically important is some level of understanding as to what kind of is optimal in the design and selection of sort of what return looks like in terms of the hybrid work environment, right? And I think today, and I think rightfully so, clients and companies are trying to figure out what that balance is. But I think the days of demanding everybody in office 5 days a week, that will be the rare exception of a company.
That makes sense to me. And we know that there are some companies like Tesla and Goldman Sachs which are making that demand. But funnily enough, I was talking to a staffing agency presentation, so doing a keynote for a staffing agency association, so lots of staffing professionals, and they were telling me that those are by far the hardest jobs to fill when they're remote capable people who are asked to work in the office 5 days a week. You are getting very, very low interest from candidates in those sorts of jobs.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I also think some of it is generational as well. I do think where you can have physical co-location, proximity matters. I mean, it is, I think, in terms of productivity, creativity, all of those, the optimum. But as my point is, like a step down from that in hybrid and virtual isn't that far of a step down. And in fact, if you take the Bay Area, for example, I think it's reasonable to say there's a 2 to 3 hour average commute daily, right? That's 2 or 3 hours that you could be in a car or a train that is probably a suboptimal from a productivity perspective, right? So I think this is the long game in that regard. For me, Gleb, the most important piece of this and the thing that I worry about most is around culture. And we won't see sort of the the de-evolution of a corporate culture in a week, a month, a year, or probably 2 years, but over 5 to 10 years, the ability to make sure you reinforce a company's culture in a hybrid or a virtual environment, I think that's the cause for concern, right? And that's what I always say is values are words, but in a hybrid environment, virtues are actions, right? So it's fine to have values, but I think it could be more important to have virtues, right? Where the actions really reflect what a company is going to be a critical item. For our case, we have kind of an apprenticeship-based business, right? I mean, you sort of learn by doing next to people, and you can do a lot of that virtually, but some of it you lose not in person, right? So I think that's, to me, the biggest concern about this. I think productivity, efficiency, effectiveness, people getting jobs done is kind of table stakes, but how do you maintain the essence of your company?
Interesting. So there are a number of companies like GitLab which have been virtual for long before the pandemic and which have been quite successful at transmitting their culture. And what are your perceptions about these remote first companies which were remote first before the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few of them, right? I spent a lot of time in tech, and I think if you're remote first and you were sort of remote native, right? You were born remote. I think that is a big piece of your culture, right? You may drive people and acquire people and talent who really likes to work more asynchronously or likes to be values their flexibility and freedom. I think the challenge is always in the transition from one thing to another. So I think those companies that have started native virtual, I think they have established a strong culture and they orient around those people. I think very large companies who've historically been in person, that's really the challenge, is how do you retain that? Or how do you explicitly modify your culture over time to be more of a hybrid workplace, right? And I think that's probably the more logical answer. Cultures will change over time, but you better make sure they change in a way that you believe is sort of accretive to your company.
It's when we look at the culture, it's interesting. I was looking at a survey of what kind of workers have the most connection to each other, which is really the essence of culture. And it seems that it's neither in general, when you look at remote, hybrid, and full-time in office workers who are remote capable, the biggest culture engagement comes from workers who are hybrid. So people who are remote capable but are forced to be in the office full-time, that cause a lot of disengagement and disenchantment. Where remote capable employees who are fully remote, unless they're in a remote first company, as you pointed out, they are going to have some struggles with maintaining culture. There are some strategies. So I've helped a number of clients. Of my 25 clients that I helped, 2 of them chose to be remote first, and 23 of them chose to be hybrid first. And for the remote first clients, we figured out a number of strategies to help them facilitate culture in their companies. But the hybrid first seem like that's the best balance, where they're coming into the office for the things that are best done in the office, like collaboration, conversation, socializing, which is the essence of maintaining culture. And they're doing their individual work at home. And of course, most of the work that people do is individual work, working on their emails, working on video conference calls, writing reports, doing programming, whatever they do. And so that synchronous in-person activity seems like it doesn't need to take that much time to cultivate culture. What are your thoughts about that?
I think there's a few pieces there, Gleb. So I would agree. I think in life, in general, balance is important. I think that, of course, in terms of workplaces as well. So I think sort of a hybrid. I think, and my advice to all my clients has been, create a compelling reason for people to come into the office. Don't mandate it. That's rarely been the case. So, and I think it's that intersection of particular project needs or program needs around teams, around kicking off projects, either around reviewing design workshops in our case, or those sort of activities. So I do think there's a balance, certainly in between the two. And I think that's where the majority of companies will land, who certainly are in sort of the knowledge worker space.
Now, as we finish up, what do you think will be the future? So you think about the balance, but what do you imagine will be the future 3-5 years from now, as we get new technology, more leaders and more people learn how to work together in a more effective way in a remote setting, in a hybrid setting, they'll do those transitions. We get new technology in the next 2-3 years with generative AI and so on, facilitating people being able to work asynchronously much more effectively than they have in the past. What do you imagine to be that future in a couple of years?
Yeah, so Gleb, maybe I'll break it into 2 points. First, maybe make a comment on AI because there's some interesting things that have come up in sort of our recent survey that sort of are interesting. In our survey population, certainly at least a third of the employers believe Gen AI is going to bring them a productivity benefit, which I mean, that's not a surprising answer. 40+% of the employees surveyed believe that Gen AI will bring them some flexibility in their work activities, right? So those are, they're different things. They're two sides of the same coin, but I think it is important that employees do believe it isn't all gloom and doom around Gen AI. It's not all this FOBO, right? Fear of being obsolete, but like Gen AI should be able to provide some more flexibility to workers and how they work. And I put hybrid and virtual into that. So I think that's an important item. Really, another interesting point is though, while 80+% of these companies are going to go pursue Gen AI, less than 20% of them have targeted education for their employees about Gen AI, right? So my point is there's a little bit of a learning lag as these companies figure these things out, but clearly two things can be true. A company can get more productivity, an employee can get more flexibility. So that's where we're hopeful on that front. On the long-term vision around technology, I think our real goal is to make this hybrid experience seamless. So this isn't so much on collaboration of documents and that sort of stuff, but Gleb, you've probably seen it as well. You've been in a meeting where half the team's in a conference room, there's half the team are individual, and that is not yet a seamless experience. Right. And I think that's really a challenge at hand. Everybody's great when everybody's in their home office, or everybody's great when they're in office, but breaking that seamless piece of work is going to occur. I feel pretty good about the general collaboration of documents and artifacts is pretty good right now. And we've got probably over a decade of that evolving. But I think sort of creating sort of a seamless view in that hybrid will be really the big difference over the next few years. And I think it will make a huge impact.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, Ken. This was very helpful.
Great. Thanks, Gleb. I appreciate the time.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and it helps us improve the show. All right, everyone. I'll see you in the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. In the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.